"Ma'am, I need to see your ticket again." The flight attendant's voice was sharp, her eyes narrowing as she leaned closer. "First class isn't for everyone." The woman seated by the window calmly raised her gaze, her words like a quiet storm. "Are you saying I don't belong here?" Passengers around them froze, their conversations fading into silence. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Who was this woman, and why was she being treated this way? Moments later, the flight captain's voice cut through the tension. "Do you know who that passenger is? You just made the biggest mistake of your career." What led to this explosive moment? What happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about respect and judgment. Before we dive into the story, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a situation like this? Or perhaps you've faced a moment where standing up for what's right was the only choice? Let us know. Where are you tuning in from today? It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss heartwarming and inspiring stories about equality, love, and compassion on this journey of kindness. Let's jump right into today's story. Rachel Morgan stepped onto the flight from Dallas to San Francisco, her hand resting lightly on the curve of her 7 months pregnant belly. As CEO of Blue Horizon Airways, Rachel had made it a personal mission to ensure her airline delivered the best service possible. But she knew reports and data often failed to capture the true customer experience. Today, she was here to see for herself. Dressed in a simple light blue dress and carrying a modest handbag, Rachel's demeanor exuded calm confidence. She moved purposefully through the jet bridge and into the first-class cabin, her sharp eyes scanning the setup. She noticed the crisp arrangement of the seats, the neat placement of the menus, and the soft ambient lighting meant to soothe premium passengers. Rachel allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "There's nothing like experiencing it firsthand," she thought. Jessica Taylor, the senior flight attendant with over 15 years of experience, was stationed near the first-class galley. Her sharp eyes followed Rachel as she entered the cabin. Something about Rachel unsettled her, though she couldn't quite place why. Jessica prided herself on her professionalism, but her instincts whispered doubts. This woman, she doesn't look like the typical first-class passenger, Jessica mused internally, her thoughts tinged with unconscious bias. Jessica leaned closer to her colleague, a younger flight attendant who had just finished arranging the welcome drinks. "She's sitting in first class?" Jessica asked, keeping her voice low but firm. The younger attendant glanced up briefly, shrugging. "I think so. Her ticket seemed fine when she boarded." "Why?" Jessica straightened her posture, her eyes still fixed on Rachel as she settled into her seat near the window. "I'll double-check. Better safe than sorry," she replied briskly, a hint of skepticism in her tone. Rachel, oblivious to the scrutiny, adjusted her seat, carefully stowing her handbag beneath it. Her fingers brushed over the soft leather armrest as she inspected her surroundings. The cabin seemed immaculate, just as it should be for a premium service. She let out a breath of contentment, ready to observe the flight experience without interference. But Jessica couldn't let it go. Her eyes lingered on Rachel, narrowing slightly. From her years in the industry, Jessica believed she had developed a keen sense for spotting potential disruptions. She doesn't fit the profile, Jessica thought again, her bias clouding her judgment. The first-class cabin maintained an outward air of tranquility, with passengers sipping champagne and scrolling through their phones. Yet, an undercurrent of tension had begun to ripple as Jessica's unease took hold. She moved purposefully toward Rachel's seat, her mind set on uncovering what she perceived as an anomaly. Rachel noticed Jessica approaching, but remained calm. She folded her hands over her lap and met Jessica's gaze with an expression of quiet curiosity. The unspoken question in Rachel's eyes seemed to challenge Jessica's assumptions. For a brief moment, Jessica hesitated. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jessica began, her voice polished but clipped. "May I see your ticket again? Just a routine check." Rachel arched a brow slightly, but complied without hesitation, reaching into her handbag and producing her boarding pass. She handed it over with a serene smile, her poise unwavering. Jessica scanned the ticket with the handheld device, which immediately confirmed its validity. Yet, her internal doubts refused to dissipate. "First class has certain expectations," Jessica said, her tone taking on a subtle edge. "I hope you're familiar with them." Rachel's smile didn't waver. "I assure you, I understand exactly what's expected," she replied smoothly. Her words were polite, but her gaze carried a quiet strength that gave Jessica pause. Nearby, Anna Wilson, a sharp-eyed lawyer seated 2 rows away, observed the exchange with growing discomfort. She leaned slightly toward the man seated next to her and whispered, "She's being targeted." You can see it in the way the attendant's talking to her. The man nodded but said nothing, clearly unwilling to involve himself in the brewing tension. Jessica handed the ticket back to Rachel, her professional smile masking the storm of unease swirling inside her. As she returned to her station, she whispered to her colleague, "Something feels off. I don't know why, but I'll keep an eye on her." The younger attendant glanced at Jessica with a hint of concern. "Are you sure? Her ticket was fine. Maybe you're overthinking it." Jessica's lips thinned into a determined line. "Number better safe than sorry," she repeated. Back at her seat, Rachel remained composed, her expression serene, but her mind was active. "It's always interesting to see how people behave when they think no one important is watching," she reflected. The first-class cabin returned to its facade of calm, but beneath the surface, tension lingered. Jessica's unease had set a chain reaction in motion, one that would soon unravel far beyond what anyone on the flight could have anticipated. Jessica approached Rachel with an air of icy professionalism, her posture stiff and her expression neutral but cool. In her hand, she clutched the small handheld scanner for verifying tickets, and as she reached Rachel's seat, her voice took on a sharp, formal edge. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jessica said, holding the scanner up slightly. "I need to recheck your ticket. This is first class." Rachel, seated comfortably by the window, glanced up at Jessica with calm composure. Her eyebrows lifted ever so slightly at the request, but she didn't appear ruffled. Without a word, she reached into her sleek handbag, extracted her boarding pass, and handed it over with a poised grace that seemed almost deliberate. Jessica took the ticket and quickly scanned it, the soft beep confirming its validity. There was no issue. Still, something about Rachel's demeanor, her calm confidence, irked Jessica in a way she couldn't quite articulate. There was no rational reason for it, no breach of policy or protocol, but a lingering doubt gnawed at her. Jessica hesitated, then returned the ticket to Rachel, but not without a final comment. "First class has certain rules, and I hope you're aware of them." Rachel's response was equally composed, though there was an unmistakable firmness in her tone. "I am fully aware of the rules," she said, taking the ticket from Jessica's hand with a deliberate motion. "And I am quite certain that I'm in the right seat." Jessica blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the quiet strength behind Rachel's words. For a fleeting moment, she considered backing off, but her instincts, or was it her ego, urged her otherwise. Nearby, Anna Wilson, an observant lawyer seated 2 rows behind Rachel, noticed the exchange. Anna had a knack for reading between the lines, and what she saw here unsettled her. Leaning slightly toward the man beside her, she murmured, "She's being singled out." "That's clear as day. Her ticket's fine." The man, who had been scrolling idly through his phone, glanced up briefly at the scene unfolding in front of him. He nodded in quiet agreement, but said nothing, his eyes quickly returning to the glowing screen in his hand. Jessica, now visibly perturbed, walked back toward the galley area where her younger colleague was arranging trays of champagne flutes. As Jessica approached, her voice dropped to a near whisper, though the edge of irritation was unmistakable. "There's something off about that woman," she muttered, glancing over her shoulder at Rachel, who had resumed her calm demeanor by the window. Her colleague looked up, slightly puzzled. "Off? How do you mean?" Jessica hesitated before responding, unsure how to put her unease into words without sounding unreasonable. "She just doesn't seem like the type who'd be sitting in first class," she finally said. Her colleague tilted her head slightly, her tone cautious but curious. "You mean she doesn't look like our usual passengers?" "Everyone pays to be here, Jessica. Maybe she just likes to keep things low-key." Jessica's lips tightened into a thin line. "Maybe, but I still have a feeling." The younger attendant sighed, sensing that Jessica wasn't ready to let it go. "All right, but don't let it get to you. It's probably nothing." Jessica nodded curtly, but didn't appear convinced. She cast another glance toward Rachel, who was now leafing casually through the in-flight magazine. The woman exuded an air of tranquility that only heightened Jessica's nagging suspicion. Meanwhile, Anna continued to observe the dynamics from her seat. She watched Rachel's unbothered demeanor with a growing admiration for her composure. At the same time, she noted the way Jessica's gaze kept flickering back toward Rachel, like a predator circling its prey. Anna leaned back in her seat and muttered softly to herself, "This is going to escalate if someone doesn't step in." She glanced around, but the other passengers appeared engrossed in their own worlds, some immersed in their tablets, others sipping champagne or chatting quietly with companions. The tension that hung in the air seemed to go unnoticed by most, but Anna felt it like a current running beneath the surface. Jessica returned to her station, but couldn't shake the sense of unease that Rachel's presence seemed to provoke. She tried to focus on her tasks, adjusting trays, checking seatbelts, but her mind kept wandering back to Rachel. The woman's unassuming yet confident demeanor had unsettled Jessica in a way she couldn't quite explain. Jessica's colleague, noticing her distraction, gave her a gentle nudge. "Seriously, Jessica, let it go. She's just a passenger, like anyone else. You're overthinking it." Jessica exhaled sharply, frustration flaring for a moment. "I don't know. There's something about her. I can't put my finger on it, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head as if to clear her thoughts. "I'll just keep an eye on her." Her colleague sighed, but didn't press further, sensing it was futile to argue. Back at her seat, Rachel remained the picture of composure, though she was acutely aware of Jessica's lingering gaze. She flipped through the magazine without truly registering its content, her mind occupied with thoughts of the subtle but unmistakable tension she had felt since boarding. "It's always interesting," she mused internally, "to see how people behave when they think no one is watching." The cabin resumed its superficial calm, the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses filling the space. But beneath the surface, an unspoken tension simmered. Jessica's suspicions, Rachel's poise, and Anna's quiet observations all wove together into an invisible thread of unease, setting the stage for the unfolding drama. Jessica's eyes hadn't left Rachel since the earlier exchange. From her station near the galley, she watched Rachel settle back into her seat, flipping through a magazine with the ease of someone completely unbothered. To Jessica, it felt like defiance. She tried to focus on her tasks, adjusting a tray of champagne flutes and checking the seatbelt sign, but her gaze kept drifting back to Rachel. There was something about her, something that didn't sit right. Around the cabin, the atmosphere was calm on the surface, but Jessica's sharp demeanor had begun to ripple outward. Anna Wilson, a lawyer with a natural talent for reading situations, noticed it immediately. Seated 2 rows behind Rachel, Anna observed the slight tension in Jessica's posture, the way her eyes narrowed whenever they landed on Rachel. It was subtle but telling. Rachel, for her part, seemed to sense nothing, or if she did, she gave no indication. Anna caught Rachel's eye for a brief moment and offered her a small, reassuring smile, but Rachel didn't respond, her attention already back on the glossy pages of her magazine. Jessica couldn't stand it any longer. Something about Rachel's calm, her apparent ease, felt like a challenge. Tightening her grip on her notepad, she marched down the aisle and stopped abruptly at Rachel's seat. "Excuse me," Jessica began, her voice crisp and edged with frost. "But could you explain why you're seated in first class?" Rachel slowly closed her magazine and placed it neatly on her lap. Her eyes met Jessica's, unflinching and steady. She placed her hands lightly on the armrests, tilting her head just slightly, as if studying Jessica. "I don't believe I need to explain anything," Rachel said, her voice smooth but firm. "My ticket is valid, and I haven't violated any policies." Jessica stiffened. The calm authority in Rachel's tone made her feel unsteady, but she pressed on. Her voice grew louder, carrying over the quiet hum of the cabin. "I just want to ensure that everything is in order," she said. "First class has its standards, and I hope you understand it's not for everyone." The sharpness of the statement cut through the air, and several heads turned. Passengers who had been dozing or quietly scrolling through their phones now looked up, their gazes darting between Jessica and Rachel. Rachel set her magazine down on the side table, adjusted the hem of her dress, and stood up slowly, her full height only adding to the sense of control she radiated. Her gaze locked onto Jessica, unwavering and intense. "Are you saying," Rachel began, her voice low and deliberate, "that I don't deserve to sit here?" Jessica faltered, just for a moment, before she straightened her back and clasped her hands in front of her. "I'm just following protocol," she said, her tone clipped, as if the words were a shield against the rising unease within her. Anna Wilson had seen enough. "Excuse me," Anna said loudly, leaning forward in her seat. "She's already shown her ticket, hasn't she? What exactly are you trying to prove here?" Jessica turned to Anna, her face tightening as though she was struggling to maintain her composure. "I'm simply ensuring everything is correct," Jessica replied, her professional veneer slipping slightly under the weight of Anna's pointed tone. Anna scoffed. "It's clear her ticket is fine. This is unnecessary." Around the cabin, other passengers exchanged glances. A murmur began to spread, hushed whispers passing between rows. One man leaned toward his companion and said, "This doesn't seem right. She's clearly done nothing wrong." Another passenger nodded in agreement, but no one else spoke up, their reluctance hanging heavy in the air. Jessica felt the walls closing in. The attention from the passengers, the heat of Rachel's steady gaze, and Anna's pointed criticism were all pressing down on her. Yet she couldn't bring herself to back down. Her pride wouldn't allow it. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave this seat," Jessica said finally, her voice firmer than before, though her hands trembled slightly as they gripped her notepad. "You'll need to move to another section." Rachel inhaled deeply, her calm demeanor never wavering. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge that cut through the growing tension. "But I won't forget this." With measured movements, Rachel gathered her belongings. She glanced briefly around the cabin, her gaze sweeping over the passengers who were now openly watching the confrontation. Some avoided her eyes, their discomfort clear, while others looked at her with expressions of sympathy or quiet outrage. Rachel stepped into the aisle, her posture straight and her head held high. As she walked past Jessica, their eyes met briefly. Jessica felt a pang of something, shame, perhaps, though she refused to name it. The first-class cabin seemed to hold its collective breath as Rachel exited. The air felt heavy, the kind of weight that lingered after an irrevocable moment. Jessica remained frozen in place, her notepad clutched tightly in her hands. She could feel the stares of the passengers boring into her, a mix of judgment and disbelief that left her skin prickling with unease. In the wake of Rachel's departure, Anna Wilson shook her head and leaned back in her seat. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. Several passengers around her nodded in silent agreement. The cabin eventually settled back into its rhythm, but the energy had shifted. The quiet clinking of champagne glasses and the low murmur of conversation now felt strained, as though everyone was pretending not to notice the elephant in the room. Jessica returned to her station, her mind racing despite her efforts to appear composed. She tried to tell herself she had done the right thing, that she was only following protocol. But deep down, the nagging doubt in her chest told a different story. As the plane cruised through the clouds, the tension in the cabin remained palpable, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Rachel descended the aisle leading to the economy class section of the plane, her movements deliberate yet unhurried. She carried herself with a quiet grace, but the faint flush on her cheeks betrayed the sting of what had just transpired. She had left the first-class cabin not out of defeat, but out of a decision to maintain her dignity amidst blatant disrespect. Her calm exterior masked the storm brewing inside, a mixture of frustration, hurt, and a deep disappointment that such behavior still existed. She chose an empty seat near the window, easing into it without so much as a glance at the other passengers. The murmur of conversation that had momentarily quieted as she entered began to pick up again, though she could feel the occasional curious glance thrown in her direction. Rachel let out a soft sigh, adjusting her seatbelt and leaning slightly against the window. The cold glass was grounding, a small reprieve from the heat of her emotions. A few rows away, Linda Carter, a middle-aged teacher with an observant nature, had been quietly watching Rachel's entrance. Linda's years of working with children had honed her ability to sense when something was amiss. The way Rachel carried herself, poised but with a subtle weariness, sparked Linda's curiosity. Linda leaned toward the aisle, catching Rachel's attention with a gentle smile. "You seem like you don't belong here," Linda said, her tone warm and tinged with concern. "Is everything all right?" Rachel turned her head, her expression softening at the woman's kind demeanor. "It's just a misunderstanding," Rachel replied, her voice even and composed. "Nothing serious." Linda studied her for a moment, noting the quiet strength in Rachel's tone, but also the flicker of exhaustion in her eyes. Deciding not to press further, Linda gave a small nod. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. I'm Linda, by the way." "Rachel," she replied simply, offering a polite smile before turning her gaze back to the window. The plane soared steadily above the clouds, the sunlight casting a golden glow on the horizon. As Rachel stared out at the vast expanse, her thoughts drifted to moments from her past, moments she had worked so hard to overcome. Memories of her early career as a black woman in a predominantly white male industry surfaced, unbidden. "I thought we had come so far," she mused bitterly to herself. "But even now, there are still people who see the world through such narrow lenses." She remembered being passed over for promotions she had earned, being spoken over in meetings where her ideas were dismissed, only to be repackaged and praised when someone else presented them. She remembered the microaggressions disguised as jokes, the underhanded comments about her qualifications, and the way people would look surprised when they learned her title. It had taken her years to climb to the top, to break through the glass ceiling. And yet, moments like this reminded her that some barriers were still very much intact. Her thoughts were interrupted by Linda's voice. "I don't know what happened back there," Linda said softly, leaning closer so only Rachel could hear. "But I can tell it wasn't fair. I've seen enough to recognize when someone's being treated unfairly." Rachel turned her head slightly, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you," she said after a pause. "But sometimes, the only way to move forward is to stay quiet and keep going." Linda frowned at Rachel's words, sensing the resignation beneath them. She hesitated for a moment before responding. "That might work in the short term," Linda said, her tone gentle but firm. "But sometimes someone has to say something. Otherwise, nothing ever changes." Rachel met Linda's eyes and saw the sincerity in them. For the first time since the incident, she felt a small flicker of relief. She didn't say anything further, but the faintest trace of a smile crossed her lips, and Linda took it as encouragement. While Rachel turned back toward the window, Linda pulled out her phone and glanced around the cabin. She leaned slightly toward the man seated next to her, a businessman engrossed in his laptop. "This doesn't feel right," Linda whispered to him. "Did you see how they treated her in first class?" The man looked up briefly, his brow furrowed. "I caught some of it. Yeah, it was strange." Linda nodded, her resolve firming. "I think people need to know about this." She unlocked her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she began recording a short video. In a low voice, she narrated the events she had witnessed, careful to keep her words measured and factual. Once she was satisfied with the recording, Linda paused, contemplating her next move. She decided to upload the video to her social media accounts, accompanied by a succinct but powerful caption: "When unconscious bias takes to the skies, respect isn't a privilege, it's a basic right. Respect in the sky." As the video finished uploading, Linda glanced back at Rachel, who remained quiet and contemplative by the window. Rachel, unaware of Linda's actions, drew a deep breath and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She wasn't naive. She knew that one small act of defiance wouldn't change the deeply ingrained prejudices of the world. But the small smile Linda had given her earlier felt like a tiny spark of hope, a reminder that allies could be found in the unlikeliest places. Unbeknownst to Rachel, the video was already gaining traction online. A few passengers seated nearby noticed Linda's actions and began murmuring among themselves. One person discreetly checked their phone, their eyes widening as they saw the post circulating with increasing speed. The hashtag number "Respect in the Sky" had started to trend, and comments were pouring in from strangers appalled by the unfolding story. The cabin, though outwardly calm, was abuzz with an undercurrent of tension and awareness. Passengers began exchanging glances, some nodding quietly in agreement as they caught wind of the online uproar. Others remained silent, their discomfort evident in the way they shifted in their seats. Rachel, still gazing out the window, remained oblivious to the growing ripple effect her story was creating. Yet, in the quiet support of a stranger, she felt a small but significant sense of vindication. Linda's actions, though unseen by Rachel, were the first steps in turning a private indignity into a public reckoning. As the plane continued its journey, the seeds of change had been sown, and the tension in the air hinted at the storm brewing just below the surface. Captain David Hamilton emerged from the cockpit with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades navigating not just skies, but the complexities of human behavior. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, his sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the unusually subdued atmosphere. The murmured conversations and sidelong glances from passengers were clues enough that something had gone awry. David's instinct told him to act, and he made his way down the aisle with quiet determination. Stopping near the galley, he found Jessica Taylor, the senior flight attendant, standing rigidly, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. Jessica's face was a careful mask of professionalism, but there was a faint tension in her posture that didn't escape David's notice. "Jessica," he said, his voice steady but tinged with authority. "What's going on here? I've heard there was an issue with a first-class passenger." Jessica straightened her back, her confidence seemingly bolstered by the opportunity to explain herself. "Yes, Captain," she replied briskly. "I had to move a passenger to the main cabin. I didn't think her ticket was appropriate for this section." David's brow furrowed, his curiosity sharpening into concern. "What passenger? And where is she now?" Jessica gestured toward the rear of the plane, her tone remaining resolute. "She's in the economy section. I didn't think she belonged here in first class." David's expression darkened slightly as her words hung in the air. He took a deliberate step closer, lowering his voice but ensuring it carried weight. "Jessica," he asked pointedly, "do you know who that passenger is?" Jessica hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through her composure. "No," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Should I?" David inhaled deeply, choosing his next words carefully, but with an edge of steel. "Her name is Rachel Morgan," he said, his gaze fixed firmly on Jessica. "She's the CEO of Blue Horizon Airways, the very company you work for." For a brief moment, the cabin fell into complete silence, the hum of the engines seeming louder in contrast. The weight of David's words struck like a thunderclap. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice the earlier commotion now turned fully toward the scene, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Jessica's face drained of color as she stared at David, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. I didn't know," she stammered finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize. I was just following protocol." David's eyes remained fixed on her, his calm demeanor now edged with disappointment. "Jessica," he said firmly, "your job is to treat every passenger with respect, regardless of who they are. What you've done isn't just a lapse in judgment. It's a failure to uphold the standards we pride ourselves on." Jessica's grip on her notepad tightened as she struggled to maintain her composure. "I thought I was doing my duty," she said weakly, though her voice betrayed the doubt creeping in. David shook his head slowly, his tone turning colder. "Your duty is to ensure that every passenger feels valued and respected. Instead, you've made someone feel unwelcome and disrespected, and not just anyone, but the leader of this airline. Do you have any idea what kind of damage that can do to our reputation?" The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She looked around, her eyes meeting those of the first-class passengers who were now openly watching her. Their expressions ranged from quiet judgment to outright disdain. She felt the walls closing in, her earlier confidence unraveling under the weight of their scrutiny. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to—" But David cut her off, his voice resolute. "Sorry isn't enough, Jessica. What's done is done. Now I need to clean up this mess." Without another word, David turned on his heel and began making his way toward the economy cabin. Jessica remained frozen in place, her mind racing as she replayed the events that had led to this moment. The sense of shame and regret settled heavily on her shoulders, but she could do nothing but stand there, trapped in the fallout of her actions. As David moved through the plane, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The news of Rachel's identity had spread quickly, and the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of intrigue and unease. In the economy cabin, where Rachel sat near the window, oblivious to the ripple effect her presence had caused, the captain's approach signaled a potential turning point. David's expression softened slightly as he neared Rachel's seat. While his disappointment in Jessica was evident, he also carried the weight of responsibility for making things right. He paused briefly to collect his thoughts before addressing her. "Ms. Morgan," David said, his tone respectful, yet tinged with regret. Rachel turned her head, her calm gaze meeting his. For a moment, neither spoke, the quiet hum of the cabin filling the space between them. "I owe you an apology," David continued, his voice steady but sincere. "What happened to you in first class should never have occurred. You were treated unfairly, and I take full responsibility for that." Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Captain Hamilton," she said finally, her voice measured, "I appreciate your apology. But the issue here isn't just about me. It's about a larger problem, one that goes beyond this flight." David nodded, his respect for her only deepening. "You're absolutely right," he said. "This incident is unacceptable on every level, and I will make sure it's addressed. But for now, I'd like to do whatever I can to make this right for you." Rachel held his gaze for another beat before nodding. "Fair enough," she said simply. David straightened, the weight of his responsibility clear in his posture. "Thank you for your understanding, Ms. Morgan," he said. "I'll see to it that this situation is handled appropriately." As David turned to leave, Rachel looked out the window, her thoughts a mix of frustration and determination. While she appreciated David's effort to make amends, she knew that the real work, the deeper change, would require more than just an apology. Back in the first-class cabin, Jessica remained rooted to the spot, her thoughts a whirlwind of regret and self-recrimination. The eyes of the passengers bore into her, a silent reminder of her failure. For the first time in her career, she felt completely unmoored, uncertain of how, or if, she could recover from this. The tension in the plane was palpable, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. And while the immediate fallout was contained within the confines of this flight, the repercussions were already beginning to spread far beyond it. David Hamilton entered the economy cabin with a measured stride, his captain's uniform lending him an aura of authority that drew immediate attention. The low hum of conversations ceased as passengers noticed his presence, their gazes trailing him as he approached Rachel. She was seated by the window, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Though her demeanor was calm, David could see the weight of disappointment in her expression, a quiet but undeniable testament to what she had endured. "Rachel," he began, his voice low but sincere, "I'm deeply sorry for what happened earlier. I'm here to ensure that you receive the respect and fairness you deserve." Rachel turned her head toward him, her dark eyes meeting his with an unwavering gaze. Though her face remained composed, David could sense the storm of emotions beneath the surface: hurt, frustration, and, most strikingly, a steely resolve. "David," she said, her tone measured but firm, "I don't need a personal apology. What I need is real change. Something like this shouldn't happen. Not to me, not to anyone." David nodded slowly, his face a mask of understanding. "You're absolutely right," he said. "This is unacceptable on every level, and I assure you, we'll address it immediately. But I still feel it's important that you hear my apology directly. What happened doesn't reflect the values we stand for as a company, or at least the values we strive for." Rachel studied him for a moment longer, her expression softening just slightly. "I appreciate that, David," she said, "but it's not about words. Actions are what matter." Before David could respond, the sound of hesitant footsteps drew their attention. Jessica appeared at the edge of the aisle, her face pale and her posture stiff with discomfort. She approached slowly, clutching her notepad like a lifeline, her usually confident demeanor replaced by a visible unease. "Captain," Jessica said quietly, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the engines. She turned to Rachel, her eyes flickering with a mix of guilt and anxiety. "Ms. Morgan," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I want to apologize. I'm so sorry for how I treated you. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to cause you any harm." Rachel regarded Jessica with an expression that was neither hostile nor forgiving. Her calm exterior didn't waver, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that seemed to cut straight through Jessica's words. "You didn't know who I was," Rachel repeated, her voice cool but steady. And you think that excuses your behavior? Tell me, if I weren't the CEO of this airline, would what you did have been acceptable? Jessica's eyes widened slightly, her mouth opening as though to respond, but no words came out. She looked down at her notepad, as if hoping it would offer her some escape from the intensity of Rachel's question. Jessica stammered finally, her voice weak. I thought I was just following procedure. I didn't mean to. Rachel cut her off, her voice firm and unwavering. Following procedure? She repeated, her tone tinged with incredulity. Let me make this very clear. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, is not a procedure. It's a choice. And the fact that you believed you were in the right, that you were justified in what you did, is exactly why this is such a serious problem. Jessica's face flushed, and she began to speak again, her voice quick and defensive. I didn't think I was wrong, she said, her words tumbling over one another. I was trying to do my job and— Stop, Rachel said sharply, her tone cutting through Jessica's protest like a blade. That's the real issue here. You didn't think you were wrong. You believed you had the authority to decide who belongs and who doesn't, based solely on your assumptions. And that belief is dangerous. Jessica's shoulders slumped as Rachel's words sank in. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the quiet hum of the plane amplified by the heavy tension in the air. Passengers seated nearby exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort and fascination as they watched the confrontation unfold. David, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. Jessica, he said, you've crossed a line, several in fact. I'm officially suspending you from your duties effective immediately. Once we land, we'll convene a meeting to address this situation in full. Jessica's head snapped up, her face a mixture of shock and shame. She opened her mouth to protest, but quickly closed it again, her voice failing her. Instead, she nodded mutely, her eyes fixed on the floor. David turned back to Rachel, his expression somber. I hope this is a step in the right direction, he said, but I know it's not enough. Rachel met his gaze, her own expression firm but not unkind. It's a start, she said. But like I told you before, this can't just end with an apology or a suspension. There needs to be a real systemic change, something that ensures no one else has to go through what I did today. David nodded again, his respect for her growing with each word. You have my word, Rachel. We'll do everything we can to make that happen. As David escorted Jessica back toward the front of the plane, the cabin began to settle, though the tension lingered in the air like an unspoken question. Rachel turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. Though the confrontation had left her drained, she felt a flicker of hope, a small but significant step toward a future where moments like this might one day become a thing of the past. The murmurs among the passengers eventually faded, and the plane continued its journey through the sky. But Rachel's words, and the weight of their implications, hung in the air, resonating far beyond the confines of the cabin. The seeds of change had been planted, and Rachel vowed to ensure they would take root. As the plane descended onto the runway at San Francisco International Airport, a palpable tension hung in the air. What had begun as a routine flight had spiraled into an event that passengers would not soon forget. While most people clutched their phones or prepared their belongings, a buzz began to ripple through the cabin. Linda's video, shared with a simple but powerful caption, was already making waves on social media. The hashtag #Respect in the Sky was picking up traction, and a growing number of comments expressed outrage at what had occurred. Rachel Morgan remained composed as the plane taxied to its gate. Seated by the window, she exuded a calm authority that belied the storm brewing online. She could feel the eyes of passengers occasionally glancing in her direction, but she neither acknowledged nor encouraged their attention. Her focus was elsewhere, on the steps she would take next to ensure that this incident became a catalyst for meaningful change. When the aircraft finally came to a halt, Captain David Hamilton approached Rachel's seat with his usual professional demeanor. "Ms. Morgan," he said softly, inclining his head, "if you're ready, we can proceed." Rachel nodded, rising gracefully from her seat. Her movements were deliberate, her posture unwavering. Passengers watched her with a mix of curiosity and respect as she exited the cabin alongside David, heading directly to a meeting room where the airline's ground service team awaited. The room was sterile but functional, its utilitarian design illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. A group of airline staff stood gathered, their expressions ranging from uneasy to outright anxious. Among them was Mark Taylor, a senior operations manager who had worked at Blue Horizon Airways for over a decade. Beside him stood Jessica, her normally confident demeanor replaced by a subdued and almost meek presence. Rachel entered the room with David close behind, her calm but commanding presence instantly silencing the murmurs among the staff. She scanned the faces in the room, her sharp gaze lingering briefly on Jessica, who stared at the floor. Without preamble, Rachel began. "We pride ourselves on being an airline that puts our passengers first," Rachel said, her voice steady but cutting. "We say that respect is a core value, that every customer is treated with dignity. So tell me, how does something like this happen? How does a flight attendant feel entitled to decide who belongs in first class based on nothing more than their assumptions?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to respond. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, but it was Mark who spoke up, his tone cautious. "Ms. Morgan," he began, "we deeply regret what happened on your flight. I assure you, we take this matter very seriously. We will conduct a thorough investigation to ensure accountability." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly as she turned her full attention to Mark. "An investigation?" she repeated, her tone edged with impatience. "This isn't just about investigating what happened. It's about taking immediate action. If respect is truly one of our core values, then incidents like this can't be met with delays or empty promises. We need to act now to protect the integrity of this company and the people it serves." Jessica's voice, shaky but insistent, broke the silence. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "I thought I was doing my job, following the rules. I didn't mean to." She trailed off, her voice faltering under Rachel's steady gaze. Rachel took a step forward, her expression unyielding but controlled. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice firm. "Bias is not a part of your job. It's not a rule or a policy. It's a choice. And you chose to act on your assumptions without questioning them. That's not just a mistake. It's a failure of judgment, one that reflects poorly not just on you, but on this entire organization." Jessica's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered, her words barely audible. Rachel's tone didn't soften. "No," she said sharply. "What you did was make a decision based on prejudice. Whether it was conscious or unconscious doesn't matter. What matters is the harm it caused. And the fact that you can't see that." She paused, her gaze piercing. "That's the most troubling part of all." Mark cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Ms. Morgan," he said carefully, "we acknowledge the severity of this situation, and I agree that immediate action is necessary. What would you suggest as our next steps?" Rachel turned her attention back to him, her expression thoughtful but resolute. "First," she said, "Jessica needs to be removed from her position immediately. A suspension pending further review would be the bare minimum. Second, this incident needs to be addressed publicly. Transparency is the only way to rebuild trust, not just with the passengers on that flight, but with everyone who's watching this unfold online." Mark nodded, taking quick notes, but Rachel wasn't finished. "Finally," she added, her voice rising slightly. "This can't be treated as an isolated incident. We need mandatory bias training for every employee, from the executive suite to the ground crew. And I mean real training, not just a checkbox exercise." As if on cue, David's phone buzzed softly. Glancing at the screen, he frowned slightly before showing it to Rachel. The video Linda had recorded was now trending across multiple platforms, with thousands of comments flooding in under the hashtag #RespectInTheSky. Tweets, Instagram posts, and Facebook shares were spreading the story like wildfire, many of them calling into question the airline's commitment to equality and respect. Rachel handed the phone back to David, her expression unreadable. She turned back to the room, addressing everyone present. "This video is already out there," she said. "People are watching, and they're forming opinions about who we are as a company. This isn't just about handling an internal issue anymore, it's about responding to a public outcry. If we don't address this head-on, we risk losing not just our credibility, but the trust of every customer who steps onto one of our planes." Jessica looked as though she might speak again, but thought better of it, her lips pressing into a thin line. Mark, meanwhile, nodded gravely. "Understood, Ms. Morgan. We'll begin implementing your recommendations immediately." Rachel glanced at him, her expression softening just slightly. "Good," she said. "This is our opportunity to show that we don't just talk about values, we live by them. Let's not waste it." The meeting adjourned with a palpable sense of urgency. As the team began to mobilize, Rachel stepped aside with David, who offered her a small, encouraging smile. "You handled that perfectly," he said. Rachel shook her head slightly, a trace of weariness in her eyes. "This isn't about handling things perfectly," she replied. "It's about making sure it never happens again." David nodded in understanding, and together they left the room, the weight of the day heavy on their shoulders. But as they walked through the terminal, Rachel allowed herself a fleeting moment of hope. Change was never easy, but sometimes it started with a single, undeniable truth. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. And today, that message was louder than ever. Jessica sat in her dimly lit living room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. The meeting at the airport had been grueling, but what awaited her at home was even worse. She stared at her phone screen, her heart sinking as she scrolled through the flood of comments on social media. The video of the incident, accompanied by the now viral hashtag #RespectInTheSky, had reached millions of viewers, and the responses were brutal. "Why does someone like her think she can decide who deserves first class?" read one comment. "This is exactly why unconscious bias training is necessary. People like Jessica are proof," said another. Jessica winced. Each word felt like a blow, cutting through her attempts to rationalize her actions. She wanted to defend herself, to scream that she hadn't meant to harm anyone, but deep down, she knew that wasn't enough. Intent didn't erase impact. She tossed the phone onto the coffee table and leaned back into the couch, covering her face with her hands. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For the first time in her career, Jessica felt completely lost. "Mom?" Jessica looked up to see Mia, her 16-year-old daughter, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Her dark eyes, so much like Jessica's own, were filled with concern. She held a mug of tea in her hands, steam curling softly into the air. "I thought you could use this," Mia said, walking over and placing the mug on the table. Jessica managed a weak smile. "Thanks, sweetheart." Mia sat down beside her, tucking her legs underneath her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mia broke the silence. "Mom," she began cautiously, "I saw the video." Jessica's stomach tightened. Of course Mia had seen it. It was everywhere. "I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone," Mia continued, her voice gentle but steady. But what you did hurt someone. Do you see that? Jessica closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She took a deep breath before responding. I always thought I was a fair person, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I thought I was doing my job, following the rules. But now I'm not so sure. Mia reached out and took her mother's hand, squeezing it lightly. It's okay to make mistakes, Mom, she said, but you have to learn from them. Do you think you need to change? Jessica was silent for a long moment. She thought about Rachel's words, about the passengers who had stared at her with a mix of disapproval and disbelief. She thought about the flood of comments online, each one calling her actions into question. Finally, she let out a long sigh. I've always thought being right was the most important thing, Jessica said softly. But now I realize being right doesn't matter as much as doing what's right. Mia smiled faintly. That's a good place to start, she said. The next morning, Jessica made a decision. She couldn't change the past, but she could take steps to ensure it didn't repeat itself. She reached out to her supervisor and requested to enroll in the company's diversity and inclusion training. She also began researching workshops on unconscious bias, determined to understand how her own assumptions had led her astray. Later that week, Jessica stood in a small classroom, her heart pounding as she joined a group of other participants for a workshop on diversity and self-awareness. The facilitator, a poised woman with kind eyes, began the session by asking everyone to think about a time when they had either experienced discrimination or been the one to discriminate against someone else. Jessica felt her stomach knot. She knew what she needed to say, but the thought of admitting it out loud made her palms sweat. When her turn came, she hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. Finally, she looked up and began to speak. I'm not proud of what I'm about to say, Jessica admitted, her voice shaking slightly. But I think it's important. She went on to describe the incident on the flight, her assumptions about Rachel, and the actions she had taken that had caused so much harm. I thought I was doing my job, she said, her voice cracking. But I see now that I wasn't just enforcing rules, I was enforcing my own biases. And for that, I'm deeply sorry. I hope I can learn from this and become a better person because of it. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Jessica felt exposed, vulnerable. Then the facilitator smiled warmly. Thank you for your honesty, she said. Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward growth. As the session concluded, a fellow participant, a black woman in her late 40s, approached Jessica. Thank you for sharing that, the woman said, her tone sincere. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. We can't change if we don't face our own shortcomings. Jessica felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. Thank you, she replied. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm trying. That night, Jessica returned home feeling lighter than she had in days. She sat down with Mia at the kitchen table and recounted what she had shared during the workshop. I don't expect people to forgive me right away, Jessica said, but I hope they'll see that I'm willing to change. I hope I can prove that this isn't who I want to be. Mia smiled, her pride evident. I think you're already on your way, Mom, she said. Jessica nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing her face. For the first time since the incident, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility of a better future. Change wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and Jessica was ready to do the work. Rachel sat at her desk in the quiet of her office, the sunlight streaming through the large windows behind her. In her hands, she held a handwritten letter, something increasingly rare in the digital age. The paper felt delicate, but carried the weight of someone's deep introspection. As Rachel's eyes scanned the neat, slightly shaky handwriting, she felt a mix of emotions rise within her. Ms. Morgan, the letter began. I'm writing this because I don't think I deserve to say these words face to face. I want to start by saying I am deeply sorry for how I treated you. At the time, I believed I was simply doing my job. But in hindsight, I realize I wasn't just enforcing rules, I was enforcing my biases, ones I didn't even know I had. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I haven't earned it. But I want you to know that the incident on the flight has opened my eyes to a part of myself I need to confront. I'm committed to making changes, not just for myself, but to ensure that no one else experiences what you did because of me. The letter concluded simply, "Thank you for your courage in standing up. It made me realize how much work I have to do. Jessica." Rachel placed the letter down carefully, her fingers lingering on the edge of the paper. She leaned back in her chair, her mind turning over the words. Over the years, Rachel had encountered her share of apologies, some heartfelt, others merely performative. This one felt genuine, and it left her with a sense of cautious hope. She thought back to her own journey. How many times had she faced discrimination and chosen to rise above it, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary? Rachel understood the power of growth and the importance of second chances. She also knew that while consequences were important, they weren't the only path to change. Later that week, Rachel picked up the phone and called Jessica. The line was quiet for a moment before Jessica's voice came through, tentative and unsure. "Ms. Morgan?" "Yes, Jessica," Rachel replied, her tone calm. "I received your letter. Thank you for taking the time to write it." Jessica let out a small breath, as though she had been holding it. "I meant every word," she said softly. "I believe you," Rachel said. "And because I believe you, I'd like to extend an opportunity. Blue Horizon Airways is launching a community education campaign aimed at promoting equality and respect within the industry. I'd like you to be a part of it." Jessica's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with disbelief. "You want me to be part of it?" "Yes," Rachel said firmly. "Your story, your mistakes, and your willingness to change can serve as a powerful example. People need to understand that change is possible, but it requires effort and accountability." "But what if people don't believe I've changed?" Jessica asked hesitantly. Rachel smiled faintly, though Jessica couldn't see it. "This isn't about convincing everyone. It's about showing that you're willing to do the work. Your honesty will speak for itself." Jessica hesitated, then said, "I'll do it. I don't know if I'll be good at it, but I'll try." "That's all I ask," Rachel replied. The following month, Jessica stood in front of a room filled with Blue Horizon Airways employees. It was the first in a series of workshops designed to address unconscious bias and foster a culture of respect. Jessica's palms were clammy and her heart raced as she looked out at the faces before her. Some were curious, others skeptical. She took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Jessica Taylor. Some of you may have heard about what happened on a flight not too long ago. I was the flight attendant who made a terrible mistake. A mistake that hurt someone deeply and exposed a bias I didn't even realize I had." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Jessica continued, her voice steadying as she went on. "I want to tell you about what I've learned, not because I'm proud of what I did, but because I believe we can all learn from it. Bias, whether we recognize it or not, can have real consequences. It can make someone feel small, unwelcome, and unworthy. And that's not the kind of world I want to be a part of." As Jessica spoke, her honesty began to pierce through the skepticism in the room. She recounted her actions on the flight, her confrontation with Rachel, and the journey of self-reflection that followed. Toward the end of her talk, a young man in the audience raised his hand. "How do you expect people to believe you've really changed?" he asked, his tone direct but not unkind. Jessica met his gaze, her own steady. "I don't expect everyone to believe me," she admitted. "Change isn't about convincing others. It's about doing the work, even when no one's watching. I'm here because I know I was wrong, and I want to be better. If my story can help even one person recognize and address their own biases, then it's worth it." For a moment, the room was quiet. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Another followed, and then another, until a small but growing wave of applause filled the space. Jessica's chest tightened with emotion, but she held her composure, nodding her gratitude to the room. From the back of the room, Rachel watched the scene unfold, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. A faint smile played on her lips as she observed Jessica's courage and the tentative acceptance of the audience. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. As the workshop concluded, Jessica stepped off the stage, her shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. Rachel approached her, extending a hand. "You did well," she said simply. Jessica shook her hand, her gratitude evident. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me this chance." Rachel nodded. "It's not about the chance, Jessica. It's about what you do with it. Keep moving forward." Jessica smiled, a genuine and heartfelt expression. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for the impact her journey could have on others. The conference hall was abuzz with energy, a vibrant mix of voices echoing across the sleek, modern venue. The event was one of the largest of its kind, a collaborative effort led by Blue Horizon Airways and its partners to address the pressing issue of equity and inclusion in the airline industry. Attendees ranged from industry executives in sharp suits to frontline employees in uniform, along with advocates, thought leaders, and customers eager to engage in meaningful dialogue. Amidst the crowd, Rachel Morgan and Jessica Taylor stood side by side near the stage, their presence a focal point of anticipation. Rachel, dressed in a tailored navy suit that exuded confidence and authority, carried herself with the poise of someone who had long mastered the art of leadership. Beside her, Jessica, in a modest yet professional ensemble, appeared composed but carried a quiet vulnerability in her expression. She was acutely aware of the significance of this moment, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. When the event organizer signaled, Rachel ascended the stage to a wave of applause. She took her place at the podium, her gaze sweeping across the audience. The applause settled, and the room fell into a focused silence, all eyes on her. "Good morning, everyone," Rachel began, her voice carrying both warmth and gravitas. "Today, we gather not just to celebrate progress, but to confront the challenges that still lie ahead. The incident that brings us here was deeply personal to me, but it is also reflective of a larger systemic issue. It's a reminder that respect is not a privilege, it is a fundamental right." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Rachel continued. "As an industry, we've made strides. But the truth is, biases, whether overt or unconscious, still exist. They show up in subtle ways, in the decisions we make and the assumptions we carry. And the cost of those biases is borne not just by individuals, but by the very integrity of our organizations." Rachel paused, letting her words sink in. Change doesn't happen overnight, nor does it come without discomfort. But it starts with us, with our willingness to examine our own behaviors and hold ourselves accountable. It starts with conversations like this, where we don't shy away from the hard truths. The audience broke into a brief but fervent round of applause, and Rachel stepped back slightly, gesturing for Jessica to join her. Jessica's heart pounded as she approached the podium, her hands slightly clammy. She had rehearsed her speech countless times, but standing here in front of hundreds of faces was entirely different. She took a deep breath, grounding herself before she began. "My name is Jessica Taylor," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Some of you may know me as the flight attendant who made a terrible mistake, one that hurt someone deeply and brought to light biases I didn't even realize I held." A hush fell over the room, the weight of her admission palpable. "I won't stand here and try to excuse my actions," Jessica continued, her voice trembling slightly. "What I did was wrong, it was hurtful, and it reflected an unconscious bias that I failed to recognize until it was too late. But I'm here because I believe in owning that mistake and learning from it. More importantly, I'm here because I want to help others see that change is possible, even when it's difficult." She paused, her gaze sweeping the audience. Bias isn't always easy to see. It hides in the assumptions we make, the quick judgments we don't question. But just because it's hard to see doesn't mean it's not there. And when we let those biases dictate our actions, we cause real harm, whether we mean to or not. Jessica's voice steadied as she pressed on. "The journey I've been on hasn't been easy. I've had to confront parts of myself I didn't want to see. I've had to listen to the voices of those I hurt and sit with the discomfort of knowing I was wrong. But through that discomfort, I've found growth. And I hope my story can inspire others to take a hard look at their own biases and commit to doing better." A man seated near the front stood up suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Thank you," he said, his tone filled with emotion. "Hearing your story makes me realize I've been carrying my own biases. It's not easy to admit, but it's something I need to work on." The audience erupted into applause, some people standing as they clapped. Jessica blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by the response, but she kept her composure. Rachel, standing just behind her, gave her a small nod of encouragement. The applause grew, spreading across the room like a wave. Some attendees wiped tears from their eyes, moved not just by Jessica's courage, but by the universality of her message. This wasn't just about one woman's mistake or one company's misstep. It was about all of them, about the shared responsibility to create a more just and equitable world. As the clapping subsided, Rachel stepped forward and extended a hand to Jessica. The two women shook hands firmly, a gesture that carried profound symbolism. It was a moment of reconciliation, of hope, and of commitment to a shared goal. Rachel leaned in slightly, her voice low but clear. "You did well, Jessica," she said. "This is just the beginning." Jessica smiled, her gratitude evident. "Thank you for believing in me," she replied softly. The conference concluded with a powerful call to action, a collective pledge from everyone in attendance to prioritize equity, respect, and inclusion in their personal and professional lives. As the audience filed out, conversations buzzed with renewed determination, the impact of Rachel and Jessica's words evident in the energy that filled the room. For Rachel, the day was a reminder of the strength in vulnerability and the power of shared purpose. For Jessica, it was a turning point, a chance to transform her mistake into a force for good. And for everyone present, it was an invitation to join the journey toward meaningful change, one choice at a time. Every day, the choices we make, whether big or small, shape the world we live in. This story is a testament to the power of introspection, courage, and the willingness to change. It reminds us that while mistakes are inevitable, what truly defines us is how we respond to them. Growth often requires discomfort, but through that discomfort, we find opportunities to build a more compassionate and understanding community. Kindness and respect are not just ideals to aspire to, they are responsibilities we all share. They require us to challenge the biases we carry, to look beyond first impressions and to extend grace to others, even when it's difficult. In doing so, we create a ripple effect, inspiring those around us to reflect and act with empathy. This story is also a powerful call to action, urging us to recognize the humanity in everyone we encounter. No one is perfect, and that's okay. What matters is our collective commitment to learning, growing, and fostering an environment where dignity and respect are not privileges, but rights afforded to all. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What does this story inspire in you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where empathy and understanding led to positive change? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and your voice could be the spark that inspires someone else. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to share stories that celebrate resilience, compassion, and the beauty of human connection. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being a part of this journey to spread kindness and understanding in a world that needs it more than ever.